Well, good morning once again. So last week, we started rooting around in someone's personal mail. And it's kind of a cool thing to do. Well, sort of, I guess. We actually opened up a letter that was written a couple of thousand years ago, almost 2,000 years ago. It's called Philippians. Now, as I said last week when I started, here's the downside of knowing that it has a title. We don't think of it as a letter. The downside of putting chapter numbers and verses beside it is we don't read it like a letter, and it's our intent this summer that we would read it like a letter. Do you know why? Because it's a letter. That's what it is. It's written by a guy sitting in a prison cell, probably in Rome, who has a long-standing relationship with some friends in the city of Philippi, and he wants to write them, and he wants to tell them about how he's doing and what he's experiencing in his life. And because Jesus is so central to him, he can't help but bring Jesus into that conversation. And it's a really interesting letter, but we tend to read it more as a book of the Bible or something like that. Well, it is that. But we miss something when we read it as just an affectionate letter between an individual and some friends that he has. So the guy who writes it is Paul. And if you want to get the background to the letter, we spent the better part of last week thinking through and giving some background. You can go on our website and download, click on that video and watch that. But in the course of last week, we said there's really one propositional statement that he has, which is really the meaning behind the letter, why he writes it. And it's found in the very first chapter. Here we go, verse 27. Here we go, right? We've got to direct you someplace. This is what it says. This is what Paul writes. He says, "My friends in Philippi, above all, you must live as citizens of heaven, conducting yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ." Now, you can walk down any street of America and you can be asked, what's your life about? And you can say that right there. Like, I'm a citizen of heaven. And that's going to come across as pretty good news. Because we think good people go to heaven, right? And if that's where you get your citizenship from, you're probably a good person and you're good to go. And as far as it relates to the good news about Christ, you maybe have to be a little careful how you say it and word it. We'd all love for you to act like Jesus for sure, because he has a good reputation. You might even be able to say a thing or two about it if your reputation matches that, but you're not going to get in trouble for that. But you will in Rome. In Paul's day, that's a problem. To travel around the empire and say, guess what? Jesus Christ, Jesus Kairos, Jesus the King, Jesus Lord, Jesus God over everything, including Caesar, including the whole Roman Empire, that'll get you in some trouble. Because Rome had kind of a doctrine that if you were to phrase it in a similar way that Paul phrased his doctrine, so to speak, this is probably what it would sound a little more like this. Above all, citizens of Rome, you must live as citizens of the Roman Empire, conducting yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news. And here's the good news: Rome is your Savior and Caesar is your God. You go around, say that, you're in good shape. You say Jesus is Caesar's Lord, you're in trouble. And so Paul's in trouble because this is what he's gone around the empire telling people and encouraging them to think of themselves, if they've said yes to Jesus, as citizens of heaven over citizens of Rome. To think of Jesus as Lord and God, not Caesar, not the Roman Empire. And so that has got him in a lot of trouble. Saying something like that in the Empire of Rome will get you more than a wrist slap. It's going to be a capital offense. That is so much worse than grand theft camel or whatever was appropriate. It's worse than breaking and entering, worse than embezzlement, worse than murder and rape. If found guilty, the chances are really high you're going to die. Now, that's not fairy tale. That's not fictitious. That's not mythological. That's really how the empire worked. So, Paul's friends in Philippi are aware that he's in prison someplace. They've heard about that, and they're concerned for him. And so they get this idea: why don't we send someone to go find Paul, find out where he is? Let's take him some cash so that we can help offset some of his costs in prison, which, by the way, you paid your own way to be in prison. Interesting idea. Clothing, food, that kind of thing. And so they pick a guy by the name of Epaphroditus, who's part of their little group, and they go, Epaphroditus, go find Paul, take him this gift, but bring back a report on how he's doing. We love this guy. He's made such a difference in our lives. He's an impact guy. He's just a friend. We love him. But bring back a report and let us know how he's doing. And so Epaphroditus goes off. He gets delayed for a little bit because he gets sick. His friends in Philippi are worried. Now they've maybe lost Epaphroditus as well. But eventually Epaphroditus shows up, and they all get together some Sunday night, like we said last night. And Epaphroditus has brought this letter back. And he greets everybody in Paul's name as he reads the letter, gives that propositional statement, and then he goes on with some personal comments where Paul's at and what he's thinking and where he is, and we're going to pick it up from where we left off last week with verse 11. We're going to go to verse 12, and this is how he starts. This is Paul writing his friends, giving an update on how things are going for him. He says this, "And I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that's happened to me here has helped spread the good news." And we read that and we're ready to go on to the next verse because it doesn't really land for us. It doesn't really matter all that much. It's just, well, I guess whatever's happening in Paul's life. Can I ask you what's going on in Paul's life? Yes, he's in jail. That's a problem. But what else is the everything that's happened? We don't actually know. They didn't know either. This is the front end of the letter where they're getting information. Now, here's the thing. We have to suspend some knowledge because we actually do know historically what happened, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to take the letter as it is. And at this point, we're concerned for him. All we know that is that he's in jail. And now he adds this, everything that's happened to me. What's the logical question if you have somebody that you care about and they say something like that? You want to ask them, so what's the everything that happened, right? Well, I would, right? You would too, probably. So I want to ask you this question. It's where we want to go this morning. When is the last time that you faced something really uncertain or scary or tragic or painful or maybe even evil in its nature? And how long did it take you, if ever, to get to a place where you could, even through gritted teeth, say, hey, all that stuff that happened, it happened because Jesus is so good. It happened for his fame, and it made him look really good. And as hard as it was for me, as long as it made him look good, I'm good with that. Oh, well, that's a little different, isn't it? That's a little different idea of what Paul might be talking about. So this morning, what I want to do is I want to tell you that I am aware, as you are, that we all have in all the things that have happened, and some of those things that have happened are tragic and hurtful and hard, and what do we do when they happen? I want to let you in on an interview that a couple of people had this last week, give you a bit of background. On November 2nd of 2016, that's about 18 months ago, somebody that's very precious to our church family had a catastrophic heart attack and he died. His name was Galen. Some of you met him. He was one of our elders. His family's among the founding families of our church family, and very much loved by a whole bunch of us. More than anything, he was the wife of Vera for 42 years, and the dad to John and Erica. Galen was an avid hiker, like hiked the Grand Canyon a couple of times a year, avid hiker, fit and healthy guy. And then we got the phone call that he was in the hospital in very critical condition. Very early on the morning of November 2nd, Vera and Erica and John, his children, and some family members got a call very early in the morning to say it would be good if we all got to the hospital because it didn't look like Galen would make it through the night. His heart was continuing to deteriorate and he wasn't going to recover from this. So we gathered around Galen's bed and together we prayed and grieved and cried and stood in silence for a while, and after some time we filed out of the room. The attending nurse stopped me as I was filing out and she said, did you see what happened right when you finished praying? I don't know, I didn't notice anything. She said, the interesting thing is Galen's heart stopped beating the moment that you said amen. And he left this world and went to be in his eternal world. On January 26th of 2012, After a 5-year gallant fight with brain cancer, Jenny Gillespie also departed this world and entered heaven. And her husband, Gary, and their 2 young daughters, Spencer and Sydney, would wake up to a new life without a wife and a mom. Now, I didn't know Jenny, but I'm getting to know her through Gary. You see, Gary's part of our church family. He volunteered here for 6 months or so, and about 6 months ago or so, we invited him to be on staff. And so you get to know someone and their life really intimately when that happens. So this past week, Gary and Vera sat down together to have a cup of coffee and talk about the everything that's happened to them. I want to show you part of that conversation. We'll pick it up partway through. You'll catch on as we go. But listen to the everything that's happened to them and watch how Jesus is made famous through this.
You don't always know how to respond to that. There are times where you just feel numb. Mm-hmm. You ask yourself, why is this happening? Mm-hmm. What are all of the things that we had planned to do that we're not going to do right now? But at the same time, and I don't know how much you experience this, but immediately I saw God starting to work in the situation. Mm-hmm. For instance, while we were in the hospital, my kids were with some friends, and the doctors were giving me the bad news and saying, we're going to have to do extensive surgeries. She's probably not going to live, but if she does, it's not going to be good because it's brain surgery, so we don't know what's going to happen. At the same time, I'm getting a phone call from those friends saying, hey, we just happen to be, our family happens to be leaving for a week trip to Disneyland. Could we take your girls with? My girls at the time were 6 and 9 years old. Mm-hmm. So to have them not have to see everything that was going to happen, right, and for me to be able to really focus on my wife and the situation that we were living in, that was a total gift from God.
Right.
So were there experiences that you had where you really felt like, okay, this is where God stepped in? This is where God kind of like closed the gap a little bit and helped me out?
Yeah, really. I think right at the very beginning, because the first thing I did was, after he was off to the hospital, I called Brad to pray. I called our life group, Rick and Jenny Brown, and they got up out of bed and met us at the hospital. We're there. And I was an emotional wreck, obviously, but I think just I could feel God's presence just calming me down. I mean, my kids were there, and Rick and Jenny. Oh my goodness, there were so many people in and out of the hospital. The whole entire Copper Hills staff at one point was in the waiting area with us. They came to pray. There were my partners from Starbucks. People, they were coming and going. The hospital they were amazed at how many people were in this waiting room with us. And so the support was just, it was a God thing. It had to be. I felt so loved and so supported by so many people. It was amazing.
So that's one of my favorite things, is that you work at Starbucks, right? I mean, that's a pretty fun thing, actually, right? And you've expressed how much you really enjoy that.
Yeah.
And you were able to build those relationships before you went through this ordeal. How do you think God was able to use even you in that situation to kind of show himself?
That, to me, was probably one of the most amazing things of this whole ordeal, was just the outpouring. And it's not just the people that I worked with, but the customers that I come in contact with daily, and the support that I got from them. But the interesting thing is, they didn't just know me, they knew Galen as well. Because he would come in there on a daily basis. He got to know them like I did. We became friends, and we built relationships. And yes, they weren't all there weren't and aren't all Christ followers. That's for sure. And I feel like, you know, I don't know. I've had some feedback from people from, you know, their response to what happened and how they've actually, you know, saw God work in this whole situation. And yeah, I kind of look at that as my little mission field.
That's awesome. So now you've processed a lot of it, and what has it done for you in your relationship with Christ? How is that different now?
Well, in a lot of ways now it's just me. And I have to depend on, not that I didn't depend on God before, but I have to depend on God and other people to help me do things. There's, you know, I mean, you don't know how often something would happen at home and I'm like, well, Galen can fix this. No, he can't. I think it was right, the first rainstorm or whatever, we had a really bad rainstorm right after he passed away in November or whatever. And all of a sudden the pool's just filling up with water. And I'm like, we need to empty some water out of the pool because it's going to overflow. And it's like, you know, late in the evening, what do I do? Who do I call? Where do I go?
Stuff you just don't think about.
Yeah. And I found myself out by the pool pump just sobbing. And I just yelled, I said, Galen, where are you when I need you? So there's a lot of times you go through times like that. Yeah, for you, how did you do it? You had little kids.
I had little kids. So, and luckily we had a lot of family living around us and we had a ton of support. But there still were those times where you're alone and you know either what's going to happen, you know, or it's already happened. That brings us to a place where we really have to depend on Christ.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think for me, with Galen being the head of the home, he was my spiritual leader, I guess, so to speak. I think a lot of times when something would happen, my first thought would be, go ask Galen, how would he handle, you know, let's deal with this. I'll see what he says or whatever. Now, my immediate thought now is pray. Go to God, ask him.
Almost everybody at some point in their life will experience something traumatic.
Right.
They know someone close to them that does, or they themselves do. So what would you tell someone who might be going through that right now? What would you tell them?
You know, a lot of times when we lose someone, we use that word lose, and I kind of don't even like saying lose because he's not lost. I know where he's at. You know, it's he's in heaven. He's with Jesus. You know, and I know that. So, you know, he's not lost.
Right.
He's there, but he's not with me. So we shouldn't just sit around and just, I don't know, being really sad all the time.
Right.
There's still joy in life. And I think God gives us that strength somehow. I don't know. It's not me, obviously.
Yeah.
It's coming from him.
It's interesting, isn't it, that you can read a passage like Paul writes, you know, everything that's happened to me has just proved to advance the reputation of who Jesus is. And he's good and he's faithful and he's loyal all the time. But when you see that is, like the everything that happened here is actual real people. And the sorrow and sadness that people can go through, the disappointment, the discouragement, the loss. And yet somehow they're able to get, at some point, not always immediately, but at some point to a place where they can say, God, you are good, and you're good all the time, and you're right all the time, and you've got me all the time. It makes that phrase, everything that's happened to me has served somehow or other over time for the fame of Jesus, take on a different meaning. It really does. And so when Paul's writing to his friends, it's not a throwaway statement. It's not just a positive look at life. It's what he's facing. It's what he's dealing with. And he has done enough thinking, enough processing to come to a conclusion that the things that have happened here have really ultimately served for the fame of Jesus Christ. And he seems to be okay with it. So what has happened to Paul? What has he faced? What's going on for him? And how challenging would it be for him to say that? And what could we learn from his experience? Well, if you were to look a little bit further into Paul's experience, you would read in several sections of other letters that he writes where he paints a picture of what he's experienced and what he's going through and what the everything that's happened here really is about. I'd like to show you some of those. It's a really stark list. It really is something. I'm going to start with a passage from a letter that he writes to his friends in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 4. He's being questioned about whether he's a legit apostle, whether he's legitimately sent from God to them. And he writes he said, instead, I sometimes think, because of these questions and doubt, I sometimes think God has put us apostles on display like prisoners of war at the end of a victor's parade, like we're condemned to die. We've become a spectacle to the entire world, to people and angels alike. Can you feel the grit of that? He goes on to say in this passage and some others, we look like fools, he said. We're weak, we're ridiculed. We go hungry and thirsty. We don't have enough clothes to keep warm. We're often beaten. We have no home. We work wearily with our own hands to earn our living, and we're cursed and we're abused. Evil things are said about us. We're treated like the world's garbage, like everyone's trash. We're pressed on every side by troubles. We're perplexed. We're hunted down. We're knocked down. We suffer under constant danger of death. We patiently endure troubles, hardships, calamities of every kind, beaten, put in prison, faced angry mobs, worked to exhaustion, endured sleepless nights, gone without food, and on and on and on and on. And these are not made up things for Paul. He lived these things. He went through them. And on he goes with a whole list of things. At one point he writes, he says, I don't get this. But I was given what he calls a thorn in the flesh, and we don't know exactly what that is, probably some medical condition of some kind that he says, I asked God 3 times. This is Paul. God, would you heal me? And God's response to me was, yeah, Paul, I look best when you're weak, and so my grace is going to be sufficient. Get out. Better answer, God. I could answer that better for you. And now here he writes to the Philippians. And where is he? He's in a prison. He's sitting in a prison, languishing in a prison. Doesn't know his fate. Doesn't know where this is going to end, how it's going to end. It's a prison that probably looks something like this. This is the Mamertine prison in Rome. Several thousand years old, probably almost 2,500 years old. It's an old cistern that was reclaimed for a prison. And this is in some kind of condition like this is where Paul spent quite some time, chained to a couple of guards. And you know what I think was really hard for Paul? Like all those things are hard, right? But here's the thing that maybe had no answer for him. On a dusty road just outside of Damascus, Jesus Christ came to him personally and said, Paul, I'm picking you. You've fought against me, and I'm not holding that against you. But I've picked you to be the ambassador of the good news of who I am to the world. Now go do that. Go be that. And here he is languishing in a prison, can't get out, can't do what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to be this apostle, this ambassador for Jesus, and he's got no way to be the ambassador. He can't talk about it. He can't share it with the world. He's penned up, locked up. That must have been so hard for him. And that's where he is when he writes, everything that's happened to me has proved in the end to show how good Jesus is, how he is Lord more than Caesar is, how he is the king of the universe, how he's right all the time. Is that remarkable? I find it so interesting and so remarkable. And there is a part of me that envies that kind of trust and rest that Paul appears to have. He describes it this way. He says it advances the gospel. It spreads the good news is what our translation that we use is, but the actual word is advance. Do you know what the picture is of that? It's a picture of a regiment of soldiers moving into new territory, and there's a group of engineers who go ahead and clear the brush, take the boulders away, build bridges and build roads so that the army who's coming behind, those engineers get no credit. Sorry if you're an engineer. The army is a free walk, free pass because the engineers have done something. That's what he said. I was that guy. I went out ahead, and it's serving to advance the gospel is what it is doing. It's interesting as Paul sits in that prison in Rome, chained to a couple of guards, uncertain of his future. He says, as I look around here in Rome and I see what Jesus is doing, I want to encourage you, friends in Philippi, that there are a couple of groups of people right here around me that their understanding of who Jesus is advancing and growing because of the everything that's happening to me. And they're two unlikely groups, really, in one sense, and I'll tell you why. The two groups are this. He says in verse 13, he says, for everyone here, that's in Rome, including the whole palace guard, that's the first group, the whole palace guard know that I am in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, here's the second group, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. Two groups, palace guard and the brothers and sisters who are followers of Jesus. Can we look at those for just a little bit, how unusual this would be? The palace guard, these were people that were formerly known as the Praetorian Guard, 9,000 person strong force, kind of like the Secret Service on steroids. They were there to protect Caesar and Caesar's interests. They were kind of ears on the ground, boots on the ground, that they were listening for any insurrection, any opposition to Caesar, and they would snuff it out with just no mercy. They would take people out, put them in prison. They were fiercely loyal to Caesar, and they did their job extremely well. They had a particular affinity for torture and pain for those people who were enemies of the state. And that's who Paul was. So here he is, likely in this prison, if tradition holds true, 24 hours a day chained to two guards. Every 4 hours, those guards would be turned over for a new set of guards. So over the course of 24 hours, 6 sets of 2 guards were chained to Paul. And as I got to think about this, my imagination goes off a little bit, and I'm wondering, well, what happened? What happened when those guards were chained to Paul? And I picture it this way. A new set of guards come in, chained to Paul. At some point in the first few minutes or so, they look over at Paul in disgust and they go, so what are you in here for? Did you murder someone? Tax evasion? Espionage? Like, what are you here for? And I imagine Paul looking back at them and going, well, I'll tell you the truth, none of those. Let truth be known, if you guys are asking, I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm here because I had a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. And I've been kind of his follower and his student, his apprentice these last 20 or 25 years or so. And I discovered that he's God on earth. And he came into this world as God, and he lived as God. And I believe that as much as you Romans believe that Caesar and Rome are the savior of the world, I think Jesus is that. And he's saved me and he rescued me from a really bad place. And I know that you think being a citizen of Rome is the biggest deal of your world. I had to tell you, I think being a citizen of the kingdom where Jesus is the king, there's nothing bigger than that. And I've given my life to him. And he really is. He's more significant than Caesar. And one day Caesar's going to understand that too. And so I've been going around the countryside telling people that very thing. And I can imagine the guards looking at him and going, yep, that'll get you in jail. That right there. It'd be best not to say that stuff in the empire, really would. Because that's why you're here. And that's the consequence, Paul, of going around and doing this kind of thing. You can't say that. You can't. Imagine the break room in the days that follow. A couple of the guards getting together and going, hey, what's with that guy Paul in cell block C? I'm going to have a rotation with him in a couple of days here, and I hear rumors about him. Like, what's the deal with him? And one of the guys pipes up and says, yeah, I've had 4 rotations with him, and he tells about Jesus being more significant than Caesar, and he's the Lord and the Savior, and, the empire of Rome is nothing compared to the kingdom of heaven. But don't tell anybody this, right? But it's starting to make sense. I'm starting to maybe question. And I wonder if maybe he's onto something. He's told me more about Jesus and the things that Jesus did. And guys, remember the rumor we heard? Who a bunch of Christians in Israel and that region of the world, really thought he was the God on earth. And the story that came out that the Jewish leaders and Roman leaders collaborated, that's strange bed partners right there. But they put Jesus to death, and then I know this doesn't happen, but this is what he says happened, and he's it's pretty convincing. He says Jesus is alive, and that not only did he see Jesus, but 500 other people saw him as well. Don't be telling anybody. I'll be in trouble. I'll lose my job or worse. But it started to make sense to me. Isn't it incredible that within the Praetorian Guard, 9,000 strong, whether it's all 9,000 or, that's a euphemism for everybody, right? But a good percentage or a percentage of people who were least likely to ever quit on their loyalty to Caesar, they've all heard about who Jesus Christ is through a man who's chained in jail. And so Paul says, I don't know if they'd have heard it any other way, and I'm good with that, because Jesus is made to be the famous Savior of the world that he is because of that. And I'm good with that. There's a second group of people that were unlikely to be affected in this way. And that was what Paul would call the brothers and sisters in the faith, people who were followers of Jesus in that first century. In 61 and 62 AD in Rome, it was not a good thing for your retirement to be a follower of Jesus, at least not publicly. Privately, you probably were okay. But publicly, you just didn't want to go public with that. You didn't want to tell people, you didn't want to live that way, because you would be living in fear of repercussions from that. You see, Caesar had a name given to him that was Nero Caesar. Heard that name? He's the guy that burned down part of Rome, right? Because he wanted to build some new areas and buildings in the city, and he thought the best way to get these civic projects was to burn down what was existing. And then he had this really cool idea, let's blame it on the Christians. And that's what he did, and that sparked empire-wide persecution of Christians. It's estimated that maybe 2 million followers of Jesus in the subsequent years lost their lives at the hand of Nero. This is that guy, and he's in Rome. And he's in charge. And that's where Paul is. And that's where some of the fellow Christians are. And that's who they live under. And so you had to be extremely careful about talking about what you believed in public. You couldn't go down to the local river and be baptized without repercussions. We could do that every day if we wanted to. You couldn't take communion as a church family unless you did it privately and in secret, because someone's going to tell somebody about what you're doing. You couldn't pray publicly without some concern about being cut. You couldn't gather together. It would be seen as an act of treason and defiance against Caesar. But when these fellow followers of Jesus Christ see Paul and they hear what he's going through for the sake of Jesus Christ, they're inspired by him. There's a boldness that rises up within them, a courage to do that. See, what inspires us? What really inspires us? On a real surface level, simple level, it's someone who sacrifices something really costly for the same cause that we think and believe is right and honorable. And they believed what Paul was doing was right and honorable. And they gain inspiration and strength because of him. If he's not in jail going through those hard things, which are similar to what they're facing, except not all of them, some of them are in jail, but not all of them, they gain strength and inspiration because of Paul's faith in Jesus Christ. And when you and I go through difficult, challenging, painful, extended, sorrowful, disappointing, discouraging, even evil things that happen to us, and the question would be, could we look at Paul like his friends in Philippi would and go, okay, this is hard. I don't know how it ends. I don't know where this is going. But Jesus, I saw what Paul did. And I'm inspired to think of you that same way as well, that you're always good, you're always right, and you've got this. And I am going to live as one who trusts and leans on you without explanation, without answers, because of what Paul did. And so Paul says, all these things that have happened, like right here, they have served to make Jesus look really good. And there are people listening, unlikely people like prison guards and afraid fellow believers are watching this, and they're gaining inspiration through this. And this is what Paul is writing to his friends in Philippi who face similar kinds of thing as him. Now, the end of the story would be wonderful. It was, and they all lived happily ever after, and they represented Jesus really well, and everything was good, and the fame of Jesus expanded across the kingdom. It ultimately does. But Paul also writes to his friends in Philippi to say, well, there are some problems brewing here as well. There's a bit of a fly in the ointment. In verse 15, he says, it's true that some are preaching out of jealousy and rivalry. That's actually going on. But others preach about Christ with pure motives. They preach because they love me, for they know that I've been appointed to defend the good news. Those others do not have pure motives as they preach about Christ. They preach with selfish ambition, not sincerely, intending to make my chains even more painful for me. What's going on? We're not exactly sure. It could be that there are some fakers that say they're followers of Jesus, but when they actually look at their lives, they don't represent Jesus really well, and they make a mockery of it. Or it could just be that there are people who are mocking what Paul has done, making light of what he's done, and fellow believers around. They're pointing fingers at them. But Paul says this, that whether their motives are pure or not, for whatever reason that they're doing it, here's what matters, is that the message of Jesus Christ goes out. In verse 18, he says, that all doesn't matter. Whatever the motives are, don't matter to me. Whether their motives are false or genuine, the message about Christ is being preached either way. So I rejoice. And I will continue to rejoice, for I know that as you pray for me and the Spirit of Jesus Christ helps me, this will lead to my deliverance. That's remarkable to me. Now, dare we misread that where he says, and this will lead to my deliverance? If we think that what he's saying is this is ultimately going to lead to me being freed from prison, not what he's saying. The better word for this rather than deliverance would be, this will be for my vindication. What Paul's counting on is that Jesus is true and right all the time. Jesus doesn't make promises and then pull them away. He doesn't make promises and go, just kidding. He's faithful and he's true to be with Paul, to care for him, to use him, to leverage all of his life experiences for the fame of Jesus Christ. That Paul will never be alone, he'll never be on his own, that God will always be with him in his Spirit. And that promise is true and right. And what Paul is saying is one day, every one of these people are going to discover that what I'm in pain for and the suffering and the evil that's happening to me is I was ultimately right. Jesus is good all the time. He's right all the time. And he's got me all the time. That's a remarkable thing. You know, I know for a fact, because we live life together, that all the things that are happening, for some of us, that means pain and disappointment, and you have tried to patiently wait for Jesus to strengthen and to take whatever it is that's caused that pain, disappointment, and even evil in your life. And it's been a long time. Some of you are facing some new challenges that have just come up in the next few weeks, and you don't know how it's going to end. You don't know how it ends. And you're wondering, is it worth hanging in there with you, Jesus? To which Paul, if he was here, he would say, oh my goodness, it's worth hanging in there. Oh my goodness, just stick with Jesus. Just stick with Jesus, because somehow or other, whether you ever see it or happens in your generation or generations later, your faithfulness to the King of all the kings is going to pay off. Your children, your grandchildren, maybe generations down the road are going to talk about you because of the difficult time that you went through and you trusted Jesus Christ. And not only that, but you make him look so good around with other people who live around you, neighbors and colleagues, people at work, people you go to school with, people at the club. Because when they see us go through difficulty and trial and temptation and evil, and they watch us trust Jesus and rest in him and have a joy about us, sadness and joy. What does that do in their hearts? Some of them mock us for it because we should just not trust. We should do something. Others look at it and go, if only I could trust like you do. If only I could. Either way, Jesus looks good like he is. Isn't it interesting? Through our struggle and difficulty and trials, ultimately, our King can look like the King that he is. To this end, Jesus, we thank you that Paul experienced what he experienced, not because it created him pain or sadness or sorrow or losses, but because if it hadn't, the people immediately around him, some of them would not have seen you for the good God that you are. And I know that's countercultural and it's not even logical sometimes. But Jesus, you're faithful to your promises. And your promises are that you'll never leave us, you'll never forsake us, you'll never walk away from us. You also haven't promised on this earth to fix every one of our problems and to make life super easy and problem-free. But you've promised to walk through all that comes our way. And it occurs to me, even in this moment, sometimes, Jesus, we blame you for stuff that happens in our world and those we love around us. We blame you for it. And we hold you responsible. We hold you at arm's length when we do that. Jesus, maybe if that's our posture this morning, maybe we would be willing to lean in with you one more time. And hold on again to promises you've made to us. And hang on to those promises alone. And watch how you look good in the long run. And to that end and for your fame, Jesus, this we pray in the power of your name.